Okay, we want to kind of review some of the ideas about mysticism. We talked about this in a bit last time. We want to finish this up and then look at esotericism. Mysticism, notice, is a very complicated idea. And the more we go through the course, the more complicated it will get. It's not going to get easier, it's going to get harder. It means different things at different times. It means different things in different traditions. And basically a phenomenon from the late 19th into the 20th century, a phenomenon that's going on at two different levels, is a conflation of the different mystical traditions into one mega or meta tradition. Meta meaning kind of beyond a tradition. Now that's done at the New Age level of all the gods are one, and it's done at a psychological level of these mystical experiences are all the same. So when Jalaluddin Rumi has a mystical experience, he is psychologically in his brain having the same experience that Bernard of Clairvaux has, but they interpret it differently based on whatever culture they're from. So this is a huge issue, okay? What is it beyond, what's at the essence behind this? And lots of different opinions, and we'll be discussing some of these throughout the class. But we need to recognize one part of this question is that, I'll discuss that later. Getting ahead of myself. Okay. It's used, it is a term, it's a modern term that is applied to different movements, cultures, and periods in the past. Etymologically, we discussed this a little bit, it derives from the term mustes, which means one who is initiated or who keeps silence. Literally, it means he doesn't talk about it. So there's a famous saying from Lao Tzu, Chinese mystic in the Tao Te Ching, those who say don't know, those who know don't say. That is, if you really are a mystic, you're not going to tell people about it. So this is an esotericism and also a mysticism in that regard. The mysterion are the divine secrets that the mystic learns. Mystikos, things related to the mysterion. Okay, so the initiate, the mustes, is one who has received the knowledge or practices, the mystikos, which gives him knowledge of the mysterion. Does that make sense? Now, in the classical formation of mysticism, basically what it means is knowledge about certain things, and most importantly, the mystical knowledge of God. Now, Paul uses this mystery language quite a bit. These are all the passages in Paul where mysticism, or not mysticism, but mystery is mentioned. And he is, throughout his letters, is saying, I'm going to reveal to you a mystery. This is the mystery of God. He uses that type of language. And he's referring to some secret plan or idea or information about God that he can reveal to the people because it's been revealed to him through his own revelatory experiences in the Road to Damascus is the most famous, but it's not the most important by any means. It's the least important of his experiences. There's one in the temple where he has a vision of what he calls Hodikaios, the just one, meaning Christ. And then the other one is his ascent into the third heaven, described in one of his letters, where he says, I met a man who had ascended into the third heaven, whether in the flesh or not, I know not. Meaning, he doesn't know if he physically ascended into heaven or was, in the spirit or whatever. Okay, so here's mystery language in Paul. Now, one of the characteristics of mysticism is the search for knowledge. Now, this knowledge is generally something that is not known to ordinary people and cannot be obtained through ordinary discursive means. So most people don't know it, and most people, and you can't learn it just by somebody telling you. All right? Has to be experienced. I've listed here a couple of the knowledge terms in different languages. It's ma'arifa in Arabic, jnana in Sanskrit. Gnosis is the one we use the most, and it means knowledge. Notice it's cognate with our term, with jnana here in Sanskrit. The G, the N, that root is the old Indo-European root for knowledge, and it's the same word here. It's just it goes from a j to a g to a k, which are all phonetically same sound pronounced in different parts of the mouth. So these are all related roots: know, gnosis, and jnana. Okay. Now, what do you have knowledge of? Number one, of the universe, of the cosmos. We'll use the term cosmos for universe, and it basically meant the created order of God on this planet, the sublunar world. That is everything below the heavens, or also the heavens, but that's sublunar is below the heavens. The nature of yourself, what is your true being, and the nature of God. So you learn those things. So discovering God, in fact, teaches you who you really are for the mystics. Okay? So knowledge is a key ingredient of this, but it's not just knowledge. It is this spiritual, intuitive, experiential knowledge. And knowledge is not the only part of mysticism, because love is the other aspect of this. So you have it's immediate, it's personal, it's direct experience. It is something that is hidden from most people, and it's inevitable. You cannot describe it. Even if you've experienced it, you cannot explain it to someone else. Now, part of this is a search for unity with God, not just knowledge of God, but somehow you become one with God. The importance of this varies from different traditions. And I'm giving you here on this sheet the technical terms in some of the languages that we're dealing with. Basically, in studying the mysticism we're talking about in this class, we're talking about Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Persian. Those are the big languages. Now, there's others in other languages, but those are the major ones. Then if you want to go to, you got to do Chinese and Japanese and Sanskrit if you want to do the Eastern traditions. Okay? So ittihad just means being one with. And this language, notice, is in the New Testament about being one with God, especially in John. Now, there's a number of different, because you can't explain it discursively, you explain it allegorically or poetically or emotionally. And the second then, the knowledge of God that you receive is related to the idea of love. That is to say, you love God, and therefore you seek God, and therefore you enter into the presence of God. Now, what it means to enter into the presence of God varies from time to time, culture to culture, and different traditions and so forth. So there's the lover and the beloved. That's a key ingredient, and that's why Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, you know what book I mean, right, in the Old Testament? That book is erotic poetry, but is interpreted by all the mystics as being the supremely mystical text of the Old Testament, because it's all allegorical of the search of the soul for the beloved, meaning God. And you'll see these themes in all mystical traditions. So love, transformation, you are changed. You become something different by this experience. You're not the same as you were before. And enlightenment, that is, you finally see the world for what it really is. Everybody who hasn't had this experience is blind. They just don't understand what the world is really like. Now notice this is exactly the opposite of modern secular views of the universe, which is only that knowledge which is shared by everyone, which can be shared. Empirical knowledge and so forth is real knowledge. Knowledge of this type of stuff is delusional. It's just imaginary. Okay? The mystic would say it's exactly the opposite. This is the real knowledge. All the other stuff is just, silly, ephemeral stuff. Yes?
You were saying earlier that wisdom was attributed to be a feminine characteristic, and the Song of Songs is written to a woman. So does mysticism tend to view God in that way more? Because in the scriptures it's the opposite.
To the extent that most mystics were men, they described the love of a woman, or their love for a woman, or the lust for a woman, as the same thing as the longing for God. But they don't feminize God. They will tend to say God is beyond male or female.
Right.
Okay, does that make sense? Now, that's not necessarily always the case. There's a famous Hindu mystic, Mahadeviyaka, in the 14th century, who has all sorts of quasi-erotic poetry about Shiva, the goddess she is most interested in, and it's female to male goddess, male god. That is, it's a real god, okay, who's male, because it's a polytheistic tradition. So most of these mystics don't see God as they see God as beyond gender. They'll see Christ as male and Mary as female, and maybe the Holy Spirit as female sometimes. But God, the ultimate, is the Father's beyond gender, even though we call him Father. Okay, so what are they doing here? What type of things would be associated with mystical experiences? One is a theophany, a manifestation of God. Now, notice the archaic tradition, by which I mean, biblical and pre-classical, pre-500, 400 BC, it tends to be much more materialistic in their ideas about this. That is, when God comes, he's a person who's standing there and he talks with you, he can eat with you, you can touch him, right? The later traditions, God tends to be transformed into pure mind. So a theophany is when you encounter God in your mind, not when you see him on a mountaintop. But in the archaic traditions, it tends to be a physical manifestation of God somewhere. So that's God coming down to earth. The opposite of that is the mystic or prophet ascending up to heaven to encounter God in heaven. So, for example, in the book of Revelation, God encounters Christ in the first couple of chapters, and then ascends to heaven and has a vision of the heavenly temple, I think, beginning in chapter 4, I think it is. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So they're the flip side. They're both an encounter with God, but one is God encountering you on earth, the other is you going up to heaven to encounter God. Another aspect of this is deification, which essentially means, we'll discuss this idea more later, but it means being transformed into a celestial being, a being that's different than you were before, that you are now eternal, immortal, you have all sorts of new powers, knowledge, and in some traditions it would mean you literally become God, you become one with God. That type of language varies. Some groups don't like that language because it kind of hinders or hurts the uniqueness of God. Other groups use it all the time. So it just depends. Now, by the late antique period, what's antique? It means classical. So late classicals, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries AD. The late antique period, Neoplatonism takes over as the main conceptualization of these things, and the idea then becomes the ascent and the unification of the mind, which is nous in Greek, with God. So your mind and God's mind merge together like a Vulcan mind melt. Okay? And the assumption here of these mystics is that the intellect, remember those, the senses, imagination, and intellect are three aspects of the human's capacity to understand, right? The intellect's the highest, and the intellect is more real than the body. So having a nous or mind unification with God is better than seeing God in person. It's more real because God is pure mind. Now that's an assumption that they had, whether that's correct or not. That's how they viewed it. Everybody with me on this? Now, sometimes we call this out-of-body experience, and it's basically where the mystic, his body's sitting there, and his friends can see him, but he's not conscious of anything that's around him. There's a famous story of a monk a Byzantine monk. I've forgotten his name, but he was in a church, and he was kneeling, kind of prostrate before an icon. I think it was Mary, but maybe just some icon. And his friends, the other monks, were around, and they were really, and he just lay there and lay there and lay there, and he never got up. He seemed to be dead. They got really worried about him. They came up to him, they grab him, are you okay? What's going on? And he kind of comes to his senses and starts talking to them. He gets really mad at them because he says, I was in the presence of God, and you broke it. You disturbed me. So his body was lying there in like a coma or a stupor, but in his mind, he was in the presence of God. You see what I'm saying?
It's like Alma.
Right. Alma's, and the guys, the Lamanite king too. Yeah, he's there for, 3 days? Seems to be dead. He's really in the presence of God. So that type of thing's going on. Now, the modern interpretation, by which I mean secular, when I talk about modernism, I mean secular modernism, which is kind of a set of ideas and assumptions about both the world, society, and mankind, which have, began in the Enlightenment and have spread and basically dominate our society today. They basically view all this as psychological. Some strange, aberrant brain chemistry is going on. They don't deny the legitimacy or existence of mystical experiences. They just say it's all in their head. They're making it up. Or they're not really making it up. They're firing of neurons in a weird way gives them a hallucination or whatever. And the assumption behind this is all religious experience and phenomenon are psychological. So that there is this secular approach too. So notice there is kind of the more materialistic approach of the archaic world. There's the nous intellect approach of the Neoplatonist world, and we'll discuss Neoplatonism in a time or two. And then there's the psychological approach. And the main proponents of this is Jung, Carl Jung, who we'll discuss probably a little later. And then his popularizer is Joseph Campbell. Jung is more of a theist than Campbell. I think Campbell's basically, it's all about, the mysticism is all about coming to know yourself. You can't know about the cosmos through mysticism. You can't know about God through mysticism, but you can know yourself. And so they've, reduced the mystical knowledge you're seeking to just knowledge of self, which is one of the three that the ancient mystics had. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, what are they trying to do? Some type of unmediated experience of God, or experiencing the presence of God. Visions are involved in this, altered states of consciousness. Overwhelming sense of bliss, intense contemplation, that is just focused, like repeating a prayer over and over and over and over again, repeating the 99 names of God, the Hail Mary, the Jesus prayer, which is, Jesus, Son of Man, have mercy on me, a sinner. You just say it over and over, like hundreds of thousands of times. Asceticism, which is trying to suppress the body so that your spirit mind can be free and have more, and have this encounter with God. Sometimes intense studying, singing and chanting, very repetitious prayer, controlling your breathing, controlling body posture. This is more associated with Eastern mysticism, but you see it in the Hezekiah and in Islam to some extent. Okay, intense focus on a religious image or symbol or sound. So you'll get an icon of Mary and you'll just stare at it for hours and hours. Just the Spanish mystics of the 16th century. I don't know if you've seen Baroque art depicting the crucifixion or Mary or something, and it's all over the place. The purpose of that art was for a mystic to stand in front of it and stare at it and induce a mystical state in which he experienced himself in the picture. He entered in and saw and witnessed the crucifixion. And you'll often see these guys, paintings of churchmen or whatever, in the painting. So here's Jesus crucified, and some contemporary guy is standing there watching it. You know what I'm saying? You see that. That's because part of what's going on with this veneration of the images. that you see in some religions. Now in Islam, it doesn't work, so they don't do images, but they will do geometric patterning, arabesques they're called. Now, often mystics organize themselves into groups, sometimes called paths or orders. These might be monastic orders in the West, or Sufi tariqa. Tariqa means order or path or road in Arabic. So the tariqa is a Sufi order. There's often a mystical master who has achieved some of these experiences, and he trains the disciple. And basically the mystical master sits there and the disciple says, I want to follow this. He goes to the master, tries to be accepted as a student, and they're often given a preliminary time of a month, and sometimes they'll say, for example, okay, you want to be my disciple? Don't talk to me. And then they'll go around for a year, literally a year, and if the disciple says anything to the master, he's out, he's kicked out. But if he just in silence follows, imitates, copies, but never asks a question, then he can go to the next stage. So I mean, there's some kind of what we would call excessive discipline involved in this. A key characteristic of mysticism is an overwhelming devotion and love for God. Sometimes a sense that you've lost your own self-identity and that you're completely absorbed with God. There's also the idea of ecstasy, which is important to grasp. Ecstasis means to stand outside in Greek. It is mentioned in a couple of Paul's visions in the book of Acts, where they say Paul was in ecstasis. Ek is outside, stasis is to stand. So standing outside yourself. And basically it means where your body's there, but you don't, you're not there in your body. It's the idea that there can be a cognitive separation of body from nous, or mind, or spirit, or soul. Okay? Now, whether that's possible, of course, the modern guys would, a modern secularist would say, what about ecstasy? He's just in a brain state where he doesn't sense his body there, right? He has, the mind hasn't gone anywhere, it's just, he's not sensing his body. Okay, it's ineffable, meaning you can't describe it, teach it, or learn it. You have to experience it. It's often called apophatic. You'll see that term popping up a lot in these texts. It means negative. That is to say, you can't say it's this, 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 and this. You can say it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this, but you can't ever say what it is. You just say what it's not. So this gets a little annoying sometimes, because whatever there is, they'll say it's not that. I mean, it's not light, and it's not darkness, and it's not sound, and it's not silence. You know, they'll just go on and on like this. It annoys me, but that's what they do. So it's called apophatic. This is again from the Greek of basically you can't. And it's the idea you can't describe it, therefore, however you talk about it, it's not that, right? Because you can't describe it. It's part of the ineffable idea. It's salvific, that is, it makes you achieve salvation, and it's kind of a partial taste of ultimate salvation. So when you are in heaven and in the end with God, you are eternally and fully and constantly in the mystical experience. So you get a little hint of it, a few moments of a taste of heaven. This is this supreme bliss. And we talked about the Gnostic knowledge gaining. Now, a lot of this is associated with celestial ascent. That is, it is a different form of celestial ascent. The idea that the human can ascend into God, or ascend up to God, and be with God, and encounter God, and be in His presence. Now, if you look at the archaic ideas about this meant literally the guy's going up into heaven. I mean, he's physically there. The Neoplatonic view is that it's the mind. The celestial ascent is a human mind uniting with the mind of God. Okay? And you can see here lots of temple-related ideas. That is, the temple is a center of where you encounter God, and so the celestial ascent idea is associated with temple phenomenon, practices, visions in the temple, and so forth. Here's an interesting one. We tend to think of Paul's vision on the road to Damascus as his, supreme revelation. But in fact, what was that about? It was a call to repentance and sent him off to, basically it was a condemnation of Paul. It wasn't calling him to be a prophet. It wasn't calling him to be a missionary. It was a condemnation. He goes off and studies and wanders for years before he's actually called. And the call is associated in part with Acts 22:17, where he's in the temple and he has a vision of Christ, appears to him in the temple, and then calls him to be the missionary to the Gentiles. That's much later than his first vision. So in a sense, Paul's first vision isn't mystical, is it? All visions are not necessarily mystical, because he's condemned and he's called to repentance, but he doesn't feel one with God. He goes blind instead of being enlightened, and his blindness is his reverting to his real spiritual state. That is, he was blind to the true nature of God before. You see what I'm saying? Okay. We've talked about deification. Here's some of the technical terms about this. Henosis is becoming one with God. Theosis is becoming God. And these are interlocking ideas often. Now, we're going to be discussing a number of different forms of mysticism, of which I just listed some basic ones here. One is Merkabah, which means chariot mysticism. And it is one form of Jewish mysticism associated with the chariot throne vision of Ezekiel in chapters 1 and 10 of Ezekiel, and with Elijah's ascent into heaven in the fiery chariot of God. So we'll discuss this later, but notice I might use the term Merkabah now and then. And it is the mystical contemplation of the chariot, so that in a sense the mystic can enter into the chariot of God and then enter in his presence and gain this revelatory thing. So there's the chariot or Merkabah mysticism. We'll discuss this a lot more later, but for now, just note that that's an issue. And then the other one in Jewish mysticism is Hechalot, which means temples or palaces. Hekal just means big house, and it refers to the palace of the king or the temple of God. So usually the temple of God in the Old Testament is called Beit, which is house. Sometimes it's called Hekal, which is palace, and it's usually translated as temple when it says that in terms of the religious temple, and it's translated as palace when it refers to a king's Hekal is translated palace, God's Hekal is translated temple. So it's an aberration in translation, but that's what's behind it. Okay? And this is then temple mysticism. And Elior Rachel has a good book on this, The Three Temples. How the rise of Jewish mysticism is in direct relationship to the destruction of the temple and their inability to worship there on earth, and so they begin to have visionary worship being in the temple in heaven, which is the eternal temple. And if you look at the book of Revelation, John is a Hekalot mystic. He is going up into the heavenly temple and gaining, finding the presence of God, gaining new knowledge, etc., right? Then there's Neoplatonic mysticism. Plato is the 4th century BC Greek philosopher who is most important in mystical thought. His ideas get picked up by Jews, Christians, and Muslims and form a understrata of lots of different forms of mysticism. For Plato, God is pure mind, and this idea then spreads around from Plato. And it becomes the intellect of the human, or the union of the human intellect /mind/nous with that of God. That becomes the goal. Now, this is a pagan philosophy that gets Judaized by Plato, Christianized by Dionysius the Areopagite, and then brought into Islam indirectly as well. We'll discuss this in more detail, but Neoplatonism then is the philosophy theology of Plato. Neoplatonism is the philosophy of Plato as understood and interpreted by Plotinus and his disciple Porphyry. We'll discuss these guys more in detail, but just note, Neoplatonic, that's what that idea is. Okay? It means New Platonism, and it refers to, basically Plotinus is the founder of this movement. They thought they were discovering the true meaning of Plato. It's an esoteric reading of Plato. Most modern scholars think they completely misunderstood Plato, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes, because Plato, interpreted by Plotinus, is Neoplatonism. And that's what's most important. Real Plato, whatever Plato really thought or wrote or believed philosophically, is not that important to mysticism. How Plotinus interprets Plato is super important, and especially in Christianity. Okay? Does that make sense? So these are just some terms that I'll be tossing out as we go, and we'll eventually discuss them in detail, but just giving you the basics now. Is everybody with me so far?
Yeah.
Questions on any of this? Okay, when the Christians come along, there's a guy named Dionysius. We'll discuss him later, but he is the guy who introduces Platonism into Christianity. It's actually there earlier with guys like Clement of Alexandria and Origen. But we'll discuss Dionysius in some detail because of his importance on how, for Christian mysticism. Now, there's also 3 stages that many mystical systems share. The stage of purgation, illumination, and union. Purgation is when you purge your body of the sins and the attachments to the world. Illumination is when you gain mystical knowledge and practice and behaviors and so forth. And union is when you achieve the final oneness with God, be it deification or, henosis or whatever it might be. So when I talk about these, purgation is the beginning stage, illumination the middle stage, union the final stage. So with Dante, hell or inferno is purgation, illumination is purgatory, and union is paradiso. And remember, in the final scene in Dante, if you read Dante, his final scene is this vision of God, right? And he has the complete vision of God, which he says at the end. Can't describe it. Sorry. I mean, the whole book's leading up to this moment. He says, well, it was really awesome, but can't describe it. Sorry, folks. Anyway. Those are those stages, and these are different mystical traditions. We're going to focus on Jewish, Christian, Hellenistic, and Muslim. The Sassanid one is very hard to get to because the sources are fragmentary, but there was a Sassanid Persian mysticism, and then the Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist are the main East Asian traditions, although there are other ones. And then there's some Native American stuff, which is unfortunately all kind of... The Native Americans had a mystical tradition, but it was oral and tribal, and you didn't tell the outsiders about it. By the time they're telling the outsiders about it, it's some Indian Native American telling some anthropologist what his grandpa said, and it's not really a living tradition. Then you got all these white guys writing about it, and then the Indians read the white guy stuff and say, oh yeah, that's what we're doing, and they kind of redo it based on the anthropologist's misunderstanding of the Native Americans' misunderstanding of Grandpa's mysticism. You see what I mean? So it's very difficult to follow that stuff because the tradition was so shattered by, the Native American wars between whites and Native Americans. And then, there's African stuff. There's forms of it in different places. Okay, questions on any of that? So this is just kind of a big background discussion. We only have 5 minutes left. We might as well get going on esotericism as an idea. Now, esoteric means interior, inside, or inner. Exoteric means exterior, outside, or outer. So basically, these are Greek terms, and they exactly transfer into Latin. Exterior, exoteric. Esoteric, in Greek, the S, whatever the S means into and the X means out of, and in Latin it's in and X as opposed to like exit and enter. Those sounds have shifted, but it's basically the same Indo-European root. And then inner and outer is English, more or less. Okay? So esoteric means the inside, the interior, and it often, in practical terms, means the hidden, or the secret, or the unknown. Now, from a purely sociobiological perspective, human beings are the only species we know of on the planet that can A, keep secrets, and B, can lie. And the human ability to lie is intimately connected with the human ability to keep secret. If you can't lie, you can't keep a secret. That's not to say all secrets are lies, but why do we have the ability to lie? Well, I don't know. But one of the things that lies allow you to do if you're a hunter is deceive the prey. So there is early human hunting groups tried to deceive the deer or whatever by masking their scent or something like that. Now dogs were pack hunters, but they never really deceived their prey, right? They just chased and ran them down and stuff. But humans, for whatever reason, needed to deceive prey, and so you get the introduction of the ability to lie, and therefore the ability to keep secrets, and therefore the capacity for secret ideas. That makes sense to people. So there seems to be something in our nature that allows us to be able to do that, whether for good or ill. Did somebody have a hand up? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of animals that disguise themselves.
Yes.
Camouflage and things, even predatory animals that are known to be really, really good at stalking something else, disguise that they're approaching.
But that's not an intentional lie. That's an instinctive technique, right? I mean, they don't say I'm gonna lie. They just will crouch down and hide in the grass, right? Waiting for something to come by. But that's right. I mean, you can see that in other species. But I think there's a distinction between that type of predatory behavior and the human ability to deceive. Yeah.
One animal psychologists would say it's because only humans can imagine things that aren't present, that aren't like either in the future. Like animals can't imagine the future or the past; they can only see things that are in the present.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to have imagination to lie.
I think that's true too. Right. Now that gives the humans ability to keep secrets. Now, why would we keep secrets? It all depends. It also gives the humans the ability to know the difference between the known and the unknown. That is, to conceptualize the idea, there are things I do not know. Animal can't conceptualize that. So you can stand there as a human being and say, there's this mountain, and I know something's beyond the mountain, but I don't know what's there. You know you do not know. Therefore, there is knowledge that you do not know, and that knowledge is secret or esoteric. Now, God knows that knowledge, and God may reveal that knowledge to you, but there is knowledge you do not know. So there is the capacity to both keep secrets and know that there is something we do not know. Those two human capacities are part of what makes esotericism not just a human experience that we can do, but really, in some ways, an internal instinctive part of us. Now, keeping secrets in a primitive tribe tended to be a phenomenon of specialization. That is to say, you learned how to make a pot, and you didn't necessarily keep that knowledge secret. But if you were a pot maker and somebody else was a cloth maker, you each had a set of skills and knowledge that other people didn't necessarily have. You see what I mean? Now, it's not quite secret knowledge, but it can become secret knowledge. And what you'll see is guilds often made their trade knowledge secret to prevent competition. So if everybody in the tribe knows exactly the same thing as everybody else in the tribe, there are no tribal secrets. But the minute that one member of the tribe knows some things that another doesn't know, you end up with differential knowledge. There probably was a point in which everybody could know everything that could be known in a human tribe. That's